Sarah, thank you for agreeing to do this. This is part of our series, The Gospel According to You, and we do occasional chats with people. But you've been on placement here at St James's for 2 years, and it's been great to have you. But it's just really to see how you found it and to see how you're feeling just as you start your ordained life. So perhaps you could tell us, I mean, you've been the past 2 years at college and you've been here on placement and you've also had a life, an actual life presumably. How's that been? What's it been like?
Yeah. Well, as you say, it's felt like a kind of thing of 3 parts in a way, because being here some of the week, during the week time and on Sundays, and then being at college back in the normal time for about 2 or 3 days a week, and then in between, just being in between those things and being at home. And of course, actually, as it's happened in a way that no one was ever envisaged, with the pandemic and lockdown, obviously there's been lots more time at home. It's been fundamentally quite different, obviously, from how I imagined it. And one of the things I suppose I'd gone into training thinking, goodness me, I want to be sort of rooted in various places and really put down some roots and grow from there. And I've been surprised because I've had to learn where to put down those roots.
And what is the college? Where have you been at college?
So college is Riffin College, Cuddesdon. It's out in the countryside outside Oxford, and has a community of people who are there full-time, residentially, for their course, and then lots of people who are there for part-time courses, all training for ordination.
And what do you study when you're training to be ordained? What kind of stuff do you do?
Okay. Well, people do all sorts of different things, so it was a bit of a choice really to do that. Some people have obviously already studied quite a lot of theology, and others, like me, had come without any real formal theology training. So there's an academic course of study that each person follows, and that can be different for everyone. But in essence, it will always cover things like more biblical studies, talking about God and doctrine, so talking about what is the nature of God, what do we mean by God, what do we mean by Christ, and then lots and lots of practical and what they call formational aspects, about thinking in quite careful terms about what it is to be part of the church and to be ordained in the church, and the sorts of skills and qualities that we all hope for in our priests.
And is there, if you look back over that college time, because I think it's, it looks a bit like a kind of, it looks like a university course sometimes to people looking in from the outside. It could look a bit like a kind of teacher training or a kind of practical training. It's a mixture of all of those things, isn't it? But is there anything that stands out for you as far as what you've learned or what you've discovered in that time that you could highlight for us?
That is exactly like you say, because there are all these bits which either feel like a university course, or I have to say in my case, it's felt like kind of people doing their GCSEs or something. You've got like too many subjects to keep an eye on all at the same time. But actually what has made the most difference to me, I think, is in actually building a group of friends and support. And it's really a mutual support. And we've sort of helped one another through it. We've prayed with one another through it. And we've done that it started off in a very formal sort of way, because everyone's getting to know each other. But as time's gone on, we can quite easily just pick up the phone or quickly WhatsApp. And learning to bring that into everyday life has actually been the most sustaining thing. And the thing that's been different for me, because I didn't come from having all that group of people around me before I went there.
So what were you doing? What have you been doing for the last few years before you took this step?
Yeah, it was kind of you, Lucy, to say it's only a few years.
I couldn't. I have no idea. What were you doing before?
Well, for sort of 20 years up until now, I've been working in the civil service, and I trained as a lawyer. So I worked in the civil service as a lawyer, and worked in a number of departments. And that, of course, is an immensely, in a way, quite hierarchical institution. Feels quite like, in some ways, quite surprisingly, a little like some bits of church as well. So in a way that seems like a massive change. But I think because it was public service, and actually lots of my colleagues, we kind of came into it, whether we were lawyers or other disciplines, came into it because you wanted to sort of make a difference, think about things in different ways, think of other solutions to ongoing long-term problems. So that's what I was doing. And it was great. It was great. It's very demanding, and it's quite knackering. But it was good. And in some ways, that hasn't been as big a gear change as people think it might be, looking at it.
It does look like a big
Right.
gear change from the outside. I mean, just as somebody who's not, I mean, I haven't worked in those environments, but it does look quite big. But in terms of what would you have been doing in your previous life, as it were, on a Wednesday afternoon? Would you have been drafting something, or you're sitting in an office? What are you doing?
Yeah, I suppose back in the normal days, yes, I would have been probably in the office, not always, but a lot of the time was spent actually kind of talking to people, understanding the details of the problems that they were trying to solve, getting into their situation, and trying to find ways of making what they needed to try and work out work. So actually, I don't disagree. Most people's views of lawyers are like, come along, waving a book and telling you the million ways in which you can't do what you want to do. And you could play it that way. But actually, a lot of the time, I spent a lot of time working with people. I loved hearing, actually, I worked in sort of housing and housing policy, worked in children's social care policy area, in the criminal justice system, and prisons. And all these have, as we all know, just long-term structural problems. And trying to find a way around some of those problems was the kind of day-by-day work. At any given time, I'd obviously only work in one of those areas. But there's a lot of teamwork and a lot of listening to other people's expertise and then trying to blend it all together.
So how did the change happen? You say it's not such a big leap, but I mean, it's a huge thing to give that up and to say you want to be ordained. I mean, how did that work?
Yes. Well, it kind of didn't happen out of one type of workplace to another type of workplace. So I think it would be fair to say that I never sat there in the office and thought I'd kind of like a different job and that's the job I'd like to do. So it kind of happened out of the bits. Actually, we talked a bit before about those bits in between. So the bits in life that were the in-between bits that didn't have defined activities, but where things started to grow in those spaces. And there's a sort of backstory that I always felt, a strong, but in the background, notion of a sort of transcendent God, or being, or a confidence really in some ways that there was always another power that was in amongst everything. But I was very lazy, and frankly I've got lots of other things to be getting on with. And so that was in the background. And in my case, actually, it was through a series of things, but having a bit more time to think, a personal crisis which brought me to my own floor, and from which there was just rubble, really. That's how it felt to me. And at that point, what had been this very far-off kind of background God thing, quite unexpectedly, did feel like really up close. And it was the first real experience I think I'd had, because my barriers were down. There was no barrier left because the walls had kind of tumbled. That allowed that much more personal experience in. And then it was just a case of just stumbling onwards. But stumbling, but there was suddenly this little energy that came from this kernel inside that just led me on to keep walking. And it was just one foot in front of the other sort of experience, really.
Who did you tell first? Or how did you say it first? Do you remember?
Well, the experience of that closeness, actually, I told a really dear friend, who's actually a dear friend of mine, and this is a bit of a recurring theme in this, a dear friend of mine who's an Orthodox Jew, and she was a work colleague of mine, and so this is the in-between bits, you see, all the bits when you're meant to be working and you've just slipped out for a coffee or walked down the corridor. That was the person I told first. Said just something different has happened and it feels utterly different. But I did also have one of these curious things, like the backstory. I'd seemed to have acquired a few priest friends from nowhere over the years. For no reason, I thought. And so actually I did call one of them and said, there's something going on and there's a terrible mess. And these two things together, I'd really like to talk to somebody. Can you find me someone? Yeah.
So putting one foot in front of the other, because there's a whole process which we don't need to go into here in terms of discernment, and whether you go for training, and the church has to listen to you and see whether that's whether the church can see what you can feel, and put those two things together. How was that process of discernment? Because it's not always very straightforward.
No. Well, I suppose what I've sort of said already could have not been anything to do with ordination. I mean, perfect. This was what was in my mind at the time. I think I mustn't mistake this for one thing, that it might not be at all. This is, for me, a wonderful new exploration of a sense of faith and, guide and comfort, a disturbance actually, really more than a comfort, but an inspiration for what life could be. And I had an inkling that somehow every time I reached a point that I thought, I could be very happy on this retreat. It's really nice here with lighting the candles and taking a nice walk in the park, or I could be very happy at this church and going to this worship, or I could be very happy at this lecture, like St. Paul's adult learning, those sorts of things. I went to lots of those. But every time I got to one of these places where I thought, this will be kind of where I'm going to now carry on, it always seemed to lead me on again. So the path kept winding onwards. So I could see that there was, and then I mentioned, spoken to somebody else, was put in touch with another person who's, another significant person for me, and through talking with her, it just became one of those things I think that wasn't obvious to me, because I thought, I didn't expect to change work, and I didn't expect to really join in so fully into the Church of England, or any church. But I think it became one of those things that people started to mention. And I think that's possibly one of the things about vocation that, in the position I'm sitting now, I feel quite strongly about. Because I don't think that many of us perhaps would think, the thing I've got to be is a priest. But it's people read us and read ourselves back to us. And it was in the encouragement, or just the questions, open questions of others, where that all took root. And then to answer your question, how it then took thing, I just thought, I could sense there was this thing that kept recurring. And I thought, I got to the point where there'd been this previous rubble, and I just about stood up straight, and I kind of got underway again. I thought, I think I've now experienced some of the risks of life. And if I get to the end of life and look back, will I regret not having just at least said a tentative yes to seeing what comes down this particular path? And so on that basis, I went into what you mean, there's a sort of there's a whole process, isn't there? But I went into that thinking, let's see what it is.
You said yes to something that felt at the time a bit tentative. Is that what you're saying?
I think it felt a bit. I was prepared to. I did actually feel like I was prepared to see what other people thought and see what I thought when people put more precise questions to me. And I thought, and if those questions really repel me and I hate all of this, then I'll know. But at least I'll have tried. And I think I was, I kind of often think about this. One of my favourite images that I have, which is from the Annunciation, that appearance of a question posed, we know, from Angel Gabriel to Mary. And I'm of the camp that think, Mary, she had a choice. and she was brave, and she put her trust in God. But she didn't know where it was going to go, really. But she knew it's kind of going to be, I think, maybe I would discern. She had a sense it was going to be like good and difficult at the same time. And I found that inspirational. I think I carry around, I know I carry around, you know, a sort of an image of the Annunciation, because I think there's something in that saying yes, or even saying maybe yes, that was the beginning of that. So I do joke with people, you know, that classic thing where you say, well, or maybe I'll see. Words you think you've got control of, but actually it turns out you could be led anywhere.
And here you are.
Here I am.
You're just about to be ordained deacon. How do you feel?
I do feel excited. I do feel excited. I feel a sense of responsibility, not, because it is responsible. It is a position of responsibility in terms of, it's a life commitment, and I think anyone who's of a nature like mine, where I think, well, on the one hand there's this, and on the one hand there's that, and what do I make of it? You know you're taking a step that is a lifetime commitment. I have a lot of support around me. I have a lot of, great fun around me for it. There are also, in honesty, there are some really difficult things around it. And people did say at the outset and onwards, you may find that people fall away. Not that many people have fallen away, but the ones who have stepped away from really wanting this for me, they've been significant people. So there's always that to hold, and I think like a lot of things in faith life, you hold a sense of joy along with a sense of pain and sorrow at the same time, and you know that they just live together. And
part of the way that you've done your training is this slightly, I can't quite say experimental way, but it's certainly not it's not usual for the college you're at to kind of place you in a parish for the whole of your training, for all of the 2 years, and then you've gone obviously back to reflect at college. Can you say a little bit about, you've arrived at this point, we've talked about the college part, can you say a little bit about the placement part of it? What's that been like in terms of getting involved with a community and then having to reflect on that, I suppose, as you've gone along? I think it's been a really deepening experience in training, because in a sense, firstly, it's been a joy to be part of one community for so long, but it also gets you to know people, actual groups of people, and walk with some of the difficult times. We've had distinct times, but we'd have had difficult times anyway. And to be part of that has been really important for me. Every time you turn up to another community, of any kind actually, you have to find your own place in it. And in a worshipping community, you have to kind of make your own adjustments to that too. It's been a really fruitful way of thinking, I know I see God in this place and in these people. And sometimes I see that in ways that have surprised me, not in a sense of I didn't expect to, but in a sense of in different ways. And I think that's been there's something about learning to be in one place and work at being in that community, which I think is actually probably deeply of the gospel and of our calling. Much as it looks like a lot of Bible is about moving around and moving from place to place, actually it's a lot about constancy as well. And it's been great to learn some of that firsthand and then apply it back into college, which is pretty rare. And there has been that opportunity, has there, to reflect on experiences that you've had here at St James's. You've taken that back into a reflective space and kind of thought about it or written about it. Yeah, for sure. So yes, there have been bits which have been written work, and I've written about it, and there's a process of, which well, this kind of reflecting theologically about things that happen, so and thinking back on things. So a lot of reflective and reflexive thinking about what happened then, how does it feel, how do I review it
first of all, and then how do I think about how I thought about it? And that endless process of rethinking has drawn out depths, I think, for all life, but certainly out of my experiences here. And then, of course, we've had all this period of time of being online, and I've had the joy, actually, I think unalloyed joy, of leading midday prayer on weekly. And that has made a big difference to my worshipping with college as well. You know, that whole experience of leading worship or leading people in prayer in different places is great. It makes you feel very attuned to the differences of style and what people feel comfortable with, what they want to explore.
And before you came to be a placement student here, were you a kind of, would this have been a place, St James's Piccadilly, would this have been a church that you would have chosen to worship here anyway, or was this quite a new experience, or how would you place that? And I suppose I'm also asking you, you've been with us for these 2 years, we've learned equally as much from you as I'm sure you've learned from us, but who are we? Who is St James's as far as you're concerned?
Yeah. Well, the first bit of that is that I did know about St James's before I came here. I'm pleased to say, well, is obviously, St James's is well known. I knew St James's through actually my connection as a violinist and playing with orchestras and coming here and knowing it as a place that was open in the centre of the city. And that is a big thing for us, I think, that, we could come here in the middle of the day. And I did, for other things too. So, and then I knew it as a place that was, had a welcoming and generous and adventurous way of looking at what we're called to be if we're going to live our lives speaking of God and what that effect on us can be. So yes, I sort of welcomed all of those things and knew of them for an inclusiveness and about a celebration of all diversity of people and outlooks. So that, and then there's a kind of connection point anyway for me because, we're deeply Eucharistic. It's all about starting from the Eucharist, and for me that's important because I find that's the best starting place, starting with where we're connected in Christ, and then seeing that in others and in what we do, and understanding what we should do. So I've learnt a lot about the time I've been on placement here has been an enriching of all of that because I've seen it played out in more detail, whereas I only knew about it from looking on. And so the way in which we do our eco-church and our, this is rare to have, I tell my friends, this is a gold eco-church, and that sort of commitment to God's creation is really important. And then our other work as well. Has all been an outworking. I can see where that has come from because I've been part of that experience.
And what advice do you have for us as somebody who's travelled with us for a bit, over the next few years? How would you challenge us or say, have you thought about this or what about that? How could you help us think about ourselves in the next few little while?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that strikes me is I'd love to, we could sometimes feel, we all feel, we live in a world where there are a lot of people who are opposed to what we'd really like to see happen. And for sure there are parts of the Church of England where that is also true. The Church of England bears a lot of, burdens and difficulties, and we know them well. What I suppose I'd like to say is we know we have friends out there as well who would like to walk with us. Often it can feel that it's so hostile and the loudest voices are the ones we keep hearing. But I know that there are others out there who they really celebrate what goes on here. They would like to join in. They would like to be further afield. We grow that. And there's a comfort, I hope, in that there are people out there amongst the church, and there are other churches I've been in where they've felt the same way. And I think we can, there's always, there's a strength in community, isn't there? And there's a strength in knowing your communities out there, even when you haven't met them. So when we pray together here, we pray with others. That's, I suppose, what I feel. It's like there are people praying for us as we pray for them.
So keep connecting outwards is what you're...
Connecting.
Yeah.
And I think I'm entering into this role in ministry at a time where I can easily see all the bits which I hate. I shouldn't say hate, which trouble me.
Yeah, sure.
You know, there are other friends of mine and people in the church who say, why are you doing that? I mean, the church does this and this and this. I'm not really a very club joining person, which is lucky, really, because, you know, sometimes it's difficult to join a club where you can see there are lots of things that trouble you. But I also trust and pray and hope I will be part of the action that will see that in the coming years there will be change and there will be growth and there will be a greater sense of this growing community.
I mean, just on that subject, you know, where do you see the church in society at the moment? I mean, you know, that the church is rightly interrogating itself about its own description of itself as institutionally racist, following the Black Lives Matter movement last year, the 20-odd reports that have been, you know, done over the years about racism in the church, and the new commission, the anti-racism task force and the recommendations there. That there's obviously the guidance about contested heritage and memorials, etc. So, and later on this year, there's the Living in Love and Faith process, the conversations about human sexuality. So the church it can feel, I guess, it's in quite a turbulent state, hopefully quite a fruitful and change-making turbulent state. But how do you see it coming into, you're part of the church anyway, but you're moving into the ordained bit of it, as it were. What does that feel like to you as being a public representative? You'll be wearing a dog collar of that church.
Yes. Well, all those things that you mentioned, I think it is a turbulent state, and it's a contested. There's some quite contested ground in there, of course. And also, you know, you mentioned, you know, particularly the first thing you mentioned about, you know, about our call to examine our own past and present as a church that's institutionally racist. You know, that's something that came up. I was having a discussion with some of my old work colleagues, so back civil service colleagues, a couple of weeks ago, and they, you know, a bit of a Q&A there, and they were asking me about that. That's one of the questions that came up. So I take it seriously. I wasn't surprised they asked, because those are the sorts of questions that people are asking of the church. You know, if you're a place of love and kindness and of justice and of God's action in the world, what sort of God is that, and what sort of people are you? Because other people are agents for justice in the world as well. So what is it for us to be church in that space? And I think that it's really important to keep having those conversations. And whilst I will be a public person in the church, it's not my role, as I see it, to be defensive about that, but actually to increase our courage, deepen our courage, place it in those footsteps where we can ask ourselves difficult questions, be undefended in the way that we speak about our difficulties with other people. And everybody in the world and all sorts of organisations face a lot of challenges. Perhaps we can show that in that, well, like other people, but show that through courage and being open to proper discussion and proper action, that changes can happen. But it is quite an act of, well, courage, institutional courage. And I think that's, I kind of observed that, having come from a large institution, takes a great deal for anybody who's making decisions in those places to have enough courage to turn upside down or change or be really open to the discussions that people are bringing to them. But only through that do you have a thriving and living body.
So you'll be ordained just in a couple of weeks' time, and this is a slightly cheeky question, I suppose. Quite often people say that those of us who preach, we only have basically one or two sermons that we kind of adapt, or I don't know quite how far that's true, But if there were a theme, perhaps a better way to ask this is, if there were a theme that you would like still to be preaching in, 10 years' time, 20 years' time, when you've been ordained all of that time, what's your sermon, I suppose that's what I'm asking you. What's the kind of bit that is running through the core of you that you want to say rooted in the gospel, for people today?
Yeah. There is a God who's more loving of you than you actually could imagine. And that no matter what you've done, or you think you've done, or the things that have gone wrong, or the times that you feel you haven't known love, or how deserving or otherwise you feel, that God is always there and always loving. And even though there are times when that seems, because we have to acknowledge, don't we, that there are times in the world where God, you think, how can this happen if God's there? But actually, in those dreadful places, God is actually there and does love you dearly.
It'd be great to come to your wherever you are in 20 years' time and hear you continuing to say that. That would be wonderful. Yeah. And if there's anyone watching this who is kind of thinking, well, there's something a bit stirring in me, maybe, but I could never do that, or I would never go forward for that. What would you say to them if they're kind of watching this, thinking, well, gosh, that hadn't occurred to me, but maybe I have a call to be ordained. What should they do?
I think listen to your heart, talk to people. Those two things together. It was quite a thing of the heart, and it's quite hard to rationalise, and possibly even impossible to rationalise. And also, we are each called, all of us are called to be the people we most possibly can be. So we're called to all sorts of different vocations, and to understand that our vocation is lived out as the people we are, or more particularly, what God really wants us to be as ourselves. And so that there isn't really one blueprint for how a clergy person can be. There isn't at all one blueprint for how they can be. And so that rather than looking at it as a series of jobs or dressing up or that sort of thing, listen to your heart and where you think you've asked me, just ask me, what would my sermon be? Kind of, maybe that's a starting point. What would your sermon be? Or what would your message to other people be? What would your good news message to other people be if you were given a chance to speak?
Sarah, we wish you all the best. You go with our love and our prayers and our great thanks for the past 2 years, and we can't wait to see what you do next.
It's been great being here, and it's been a lot of kindness and a lot of fun, and I look forward to keeping in touch, and yeah, you can come and find out.
Bless you.
Thank you.